Picture the world you think you know. Marble columns gleaming white under Mediterranean sun, philosophers debating in shaded gardens, athletes competing in sacred games, democracy flourishing in open assemblies where every citizen had a voice. This is ancient Greece as we imagine it, a civilization of beauty, wisdom, and freedom, the birthplace of Western culture, the foundation of everything we value today. But what if that vision is a carefully curated illusion? What if the marble temples and elegant philosophy masked something far darker, something we rarely discuss in history classes or museum exhibitions? The truth is, for the vast majority of people who lived in ancient Greece, life was not a philosophical debate under olive trees. It was a daily struggle for survival in conditions that would horrify us today. Behind every elegant statue, behind every poetic verse, behind every democratic assembly, there existed a world of suffering that most of us have never truly confronted. When we think of ancient Greece, we think of Socrates and Plato, of the Parthenon and the Olympic Games. We think of the word democracy itself, born in Athens. But we forget a critical detail. We forget who actually got to participate in that democracy. We forget who built those temples. We forget the price that ordinary people paid for the glory we celebrate thousands of years later. The reality is that ancient Greece was built on a foundation of hardship that touched nearly every aspect of daily existence. The grinding poverty that left people malnourished and prematurely aged. The slavery that formed the economic backbone of society. The complete subjugation of women who lived as property, not people. The diseases that swept through overcrowded cities, killing thousands in weeks. The endless wars that destroyed entire populations. The casual brutality toward children, the disabled, and anyone considered weak or undesirable. This was not a world of freedom and enlightenment for most people. It was a world where the majority existed to serve the minority, where your life expectancy, your rights, your very humanity depended entirely on accidents of birth. Whether you were born male or female, free or enslaved, wealthy or poor, Greek or foreign, these distinctions determined everything. They decided if you would eat well or starve, if you could speak in public or must remain silent, if you could own property or would become property yourself. The achievements of ancient Greece are real and remarkable. The philosophy, the art, the political innovations. These things genuinely changed human history, but they came at a cost we rarely calculate. They were purchased with the suffering of countless individuals whose names we will never know. The slaves who worked themselves to death in silver mines, the women who spent their entire lives confined to the back rooms of houses, the children abandoned on hillsides because they were born female or appeared weak, the soldiers who died in pointless conflicts between city-states, the poor who had no voice in the democracy that claimed to represent them. What follows is not a story of glory and achievement. It is a story of what life was actually like for the people who lived through it. The ones who were not philosophers or politicians. The ones who simply tried to survive in a world that offered them little mercy and less hope. Their struggles, their suffering, their daily reality. Consider this. In Athens, often celebrated as the pinnacle of Greek civilization, only a small fraction of the population enjoyed the rights we associate with Greek democracy, free adult male citizens. That was it. Women, foreigners, and slaves, who together made up perhaps 85 to 90% of the population, had no voice, no vote, no power. They existed to enable the privileged minority to pursue philosophy, politics, and art. The marble we see in museums today was not always white. It was painted in bright colors, but time has stripped away those colors, leaving only the pale stone beneath. In the same way, time has stripped away the full reality of ancient Greek life, leaving only the sanitized version. The version that focuses on achievement and ignores suffering. The version that celebrates the few and forgets the many. This is the ancient Greece that history often overlooks. This is the world behind the myths. This is the price that was paid for the civilization we admire. This is the hardship of living in ancient Greece. We have been sold a beautiful story about ancient Greece. It begins in classrooms when we are young. Teachers show us images of the Parthenon. They tell us about Athenian democracy. They explain how Greek thinkers laid the groundwork for Western philosophy, science, and political theory. We learn names like Pericles, Aristotle, Sophocles. We memorize dates of battles and treaties. We study the spread of Hellenistic culture across the known world. Museums reinforce this narrative. Walk through any major institution with a classical collection and you will see perfection. Sculptures of idealized human bodies, pottery decorated with scenes of athletic competition and mythological triumph, bronze helmets and marble friezes celebrating military victories. Everything is presented as evidence of an advanced, sophisticated civilization that valued beauty, intellect, and civic participation. Hollywood has embraced this version enthusiastically. Films depict ancient Greece as a land of heroic warriors, wise philosophers, and passionate lovers. Men debate the nature of justice while reclining at elaborate banquets. Women, though perhaps restricted, appear elegant and refined. Even the slaves in these productions often seem relatively well treated, part of the household rather than chattel. The sun always shines golden. The clothing is always pristine white. The architecture is always magnificent. This curated image serves a purpose. Western civilization has long looked to ancient Greece as its spiritual and intellectual ancestor. The founding fathers of the United States studied Greek political theory. European universities based their curricula on Greek texts for centuries. The Olympic Games, revived in modern times, explicitly connect us to Greek traditions. We want to believe in the nobility of this heritage. We want to trace our values of democracy, rational thinking, and individual rights back to this glorious source. But here is what that story carefully omits. The democracy we celebrate applied to roughly 10 to 15% of the population at best. In Athens, widely considered the most democratic Greek city-state, citizenship was restricted to free adult males born to Athenian parents. Women could not vote. Foreigners, even those who had lived in Athens for generations, could not vote. Slaves, who made up perhaps a third or more of the population, could not vote. Children had no rights. The elderly poor had no support. The disabled were viewed as burdens. The philosophy we admire was pursued by a tiny elite who had the leisure to think because others did their labor. Plato came from a wealthy aristocratic family. Aristotle tutored the son of a king. These men could spend their days contemplating the nature of reality and virtue because slaves managed their households, cooked their food, and provided their income. The Republic and the ethics were written by men who never worried about where their next meal would come from. They never worked a field until their hands bled. They never spent 12 hours hauling water or grinding grain. The art we treasure was created often through exploitation. The magnificent temples required enormous amounts of labor. Someone had to quarry the stone. Someone had to transport blocks weighing tons across difficult terrain. Someone had to carve the intricate details into marble. Someone had to paint the sculptures and buildings in their original bright colors. Much of this work was done by slaves or by poor citizens, desperate for wages. The beauty we see today was built on their exhausted bodies. The athletic competitions we romanticize excluded most people. Women could not compete in the Olympic Games. In fact, married women were forbidden even to watch, under penalty of death. The athletes were free men with the time and resources to train. Poor men who needed to work every day to survive could not become Olympic champions. The Games celebrated physical excellence, but only for a narrow slice of society. Everyone else existed as spectators at best, or more often, not at all. Even the famous Greek warfare that we study in military academies worldwide was brutal beyond what popular culture suggests. Hoplites, the armored infantry soldiers, came from families wealthy enough to afford armor and weapons. They fought in tight formations where the goal was to break the enemy line through sheer force. Combat was face-to-face, bloody, and terrifying. Those who could not afford armor served as light infantry or rowers on warships, positions with high casualty rates and little glory. After battles, the wounded were often left to die because medical care was primitive. Prisoners were frequently enslaved. Conquered cities saw their men killed and their women and children sold into slavery. The political debates that took place in the Agora sound noble when we read about them centuries later. Free citizens discussing how to govern themselves, voting on important matters, holding leaders accountable. But those debates often concerned how to exploit others more effectively. Should Athens demand more tribute from subject cities? How should slaves be controlled? Should foreign merchants pay higher taxes? The democracy functioned to protect the interests of citizen males, often at the direct expense of everyone else. This is the reality behind the polished image. Ancient Greece was not a paradise of enlightenment and freedom. It was a hierarchical society where a small minority enjoyed extraordinary privileges built on the suffering of the majority. The temples, the philosophy, the democracy, the art, all of it rested on a foundation of exploitation, exclusion, and hardship that we prefer not to examine too closely. Understanding this does not diminish the real achievements of Greek civilization, but it does require us to see the full picture, to acknowledge who paid the price for those achievements, to recognize that glory and suffering existed side by side, often in the same household, the same city, the same moment in history. Let us put actual numbers to this reality. In Athens, during its golden age, the 5th century before the Common Era, the total population likely reached somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 people. Historians debate the exact figures, but the proportions remain consistent across estimates. Of that total population, adult male citizens numbered perhaps 30,000 to 40,000. These were the men who could vote in the assembly, serve on juries, hold public office, and participate fully in democratic life. They are the ones we read about in history books, the ones whose names appear in accounts of political debates and military campaigns, the ones who had rights. But consider what that means. In the most democratic city-state in ancient Greece, the one we hold up as the model of political participation, citizens represented at most 15% of the total population. More likely it was closer to 10%. Everyone else lived under a completely different set of rules. Women comprised roughly half the population, that is another 125,000 to 150,000 people who had essentially no legal rights. They could not vote. They could not own property in most cases. They could not represent themselves in court. They could not move freely through the city without male permission. Their primary function, in the eyes of society, was to produce legitimate children, preferably sons. Slaves made up perhaps 30 to 40% of the population. Conservative estimates put their numbers at 75,000 to 100,000 in Athens alone. Some scholars argue the figure could have been higher. These were people who were bought and sold like livestock. They had no legal protections. Their owners could beat them, brand them, or work them to death with little consequence. They were property, not persons. Then there were the metics, foreign residents who lived and worked in Athens but could never become citizens. They might have been born in Athens. They might have lived there their entire lives. Their families might have resided in the city for generations. None of that mattered. They paid special taxes. They served in the military when required. But they had no political voice. Their numbers likely reached 25,000 or more. Add it all together and a stark picture emerges. For every one person who enjoyed the full rights and privileges of Athenian democracy, there were 8 or 9 who did not. For every man debating philosophy in the agora, there were multiple people working to make that leisure possible. Slaves preparing his food, or wife managing his household, foreigners producing the goods he purchased, all of them essential to his way of life, none of them sharing in its benefits. This was not unique to Athens. Sparta, famous for its military culture, built its entire society on the backs of Helots' state-owned slaves who outnumbered Spartan citizens by margins as high as 20 to 1. The Spartans lived in constant fear of Helot rebellion. They created a secret police force, the Cryptia, specifically to terrorize and murder Helots who showed signs of strength or leadership. Young Spartan men proved their readiness for citizenship by hunting and killing Helots in nighttime raids. Corinth, a wealthy trading city, relied heavily on enslaved labor in its workshops and on its docks. Thebes, known for its formidable military, kept its agricultural slaves under conditions so harsh that mass escapes were common during wartime. Across the Greek world, the pattern repeated. A small elite of free men, a larger population of free women with limited rights, an even larger population of enslaved people. And scattered among them, foreigners who contributed economically but stood outside the political community entirely. The famous Greek emphasis on moderation, on knowing yourself, on the examined life, applied only to the privileged few. For the majority, life was not about philosophy, it was about survival, getting enough food, avoiding punishment, protecting your children as best you could, enduring whatever circumstances had trapped you in. Even among the citizen class, inequality was stark, wealth concentrated in relatively few hands. A rich Athenian might own a large house with dozens of slaves, extensive farmland, and investments in silver mines or trading ventures. A poor citizen might rent a small dwelling, own perhaps one slave or none at all, and struggle to feed his family through manual labor or small-scale farming. Both had the vote, both could attend the assembly, but their daily experiences bore little resemblance to each other. The poor citizen faced choices the wealthy never considered. Should he take a day off work to attend the assembly, losing wages his family needed? Could he afford the time to serve on a jury, even though the small payment would help? Should he send his son to war when an injury or death would devastate the household economy? The democracy assumed citizens had the leisure and resources to participate. Many did not, and for those outside the citizen class entirely, the situation was far worse. A slave had no choices at all. A woman lived under the absolute authority of her father, then her husband, then her sons. A foreigner could be expelled at any moment if citizens decided his presence was no longer desired. These were not people with agency. They were people at the mercy of a system that viewed them as less than fully human. This was the foundation on which Greek glory rested, not just philosophically but practically. The magnificent culture we admire required this inequality to function. The citizens who made democracy work needed others to do the work they considered beneath them. The philosophers who advanced human thought needed others to provide for their material needs. The artists who created timeless beauty needed others to labor in obscurity. Understanding this forces us to reconsider what we mean when we praise ancient Greece. Yes, they made remarkable achievements, but those achievements came at an enormous cost, paid by people whose suffering we have largely forgotten. The hardship was not incidental. It was structural, built into the very fabric of society, essential to everything the Greeks accomplished. Poverty in ancient Greece had a face. Historians can describe it through the records that survived. Thin bodies, emaciated from chronic malnutrition, skin stretched tight over prominent bones, sunken cheeks and hollow eyes. These were the visible markers of people living on the edge of starvation, and they were common throughout the Greek world. The Greeks themselves had multiple words to describe different types of poverty. Penia referred to the condition of having to work for a living, of lacking surplus wealth. Tachia described absolute destitution, the state of begging for survival. Between these extremes existed a spectrum of economic hardship that affected the majority of the population. Evidence from pottery and sculpture shows us what the poor looked like. Terracotta figurines from the Hellenistic period depict workers and fishermen with emaciated frames, simple clothing, and hunched postures. These were not idealized athletic bodies. They were realistic representations of people worn down by manual labor and inadequate food. Some figurines show grotesque or exaggerated features, objects the wealthy kept in their homes, possibly to ward off the evil eye by mocking poverty itself. The signs of poverty were remarkably similar to what we might observe today in regions experiencing severe economic hardship. Malnutrition showed in thinness and stunted growth. Hard labor aged people prematurely, leaving 20-year-olds looking middle-aged and 40-year-olds looking elderly. Clothing consisted of simple, often ragged garments. The tribanon, a particular type of cheap coat, became associated specifically with the poor. Disease marked bodies with visible scars and deformities that could not be treated. Food scarcity was a constant reality for most Greeks. The soil along the coast was poor and rocky. Even with irrigation and crop rotation, farmers struggled to grow enough to feed themselves. Wheat, the preferred grain, could only be cultivated successfully in the plains, and there was never enough to meet demand. Athens had to import grain from abroad, particularly from the Black Sea region, making food security dependent on maritime trade and military control of shipping routes. The poor ate a monotonous diet heavy on bread, olives, and whatever vegetables they could grow or gather. Barley bread was more common than wheat bread because barley grew more readily in Greek soil. Protein came mainly from legumes like lentils and beans. Fish was available in coastal areas but still expensive for the very poor. Meat was a luxury reserved for religious festivals and the tables of the wealthy. Many Greeks went months or years without tasting pork, beef, or lamb. Honey served as the primary sweetener because sugar was unknown in the ancient Mediterranean. But honey was costly, putting even simple sweetness beyond the reach of poor families. Fruit existed, certainly. Grapes, figs, apples, and pomegranates grew in Greece. But fruit trees required land and time to mature, resources the poor often lacked. Hunger was not always the dramatic starvation we imagine. More often it was chronic undernourishment, bodies never quite getting enough calories or nutrients to thrive. The poor had no margin for error. A bad harvest meant hunger. An injury meant inability to work, which meant no income, which meant the entire family suffered. Illness could destroy a household economically in days. Without any social safety net, without organized charity, without government assistance, people in dire circumstances had few options. They could beg, they could steal, risking severe punishment. They could sell themselves or their children into slavery, or they could simply die. Greek writers from the upper classes occasionally acknowledged this reality, though often with disdain. The playwright Aristophanes described the poor as exceedingly low-born, penniless, and useless. Commentators suggested that those mistreated by nature, meaning those born with disabilities or into poverty, were natural targets for social exclusion and ritual scapegoating. The philosopher Hippocrates observed that poor people were too consumed with the need to find food and shelter to worry about their overall health or participate in civic life. This last point reveals a cruel irony at the heart of Greek democracy. Political participation required time to attend assemblies, time to serve on juries, time to engage in the debates and discussions that made self-governance possible. The poor did not have that time. They were, as later sources put it, consumed with the need to survive. Every daylight hour spent in the agora was an hour not spent earning wages or working fields. For families living on the edge, that lost time could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. Even the language used to describe poverty reveals societal attitudes. Aporos meant someone who did not have the means to obtain necessary income, emphasizing economic incapacity. Aginatos meant without capacity or disabled, a term linking poverty with powerlessness and physical limitation. The vocabulary itself constructed the poor as deficient, as lacking not just money but fundamental human capability. Society viewed poor people with suspicion and contempt. They were considered to have low morality, to be inherently dishonest. Poverty itself was seen as evidence of moral failing. The destitute were accused of looting altars, stealing offerings made to the gods, lying and doing anything necessary to survive. These acts, whether real or imagined, marked them as outside the community, as rejecting the shared values that held society together. The poor were politically excluded not just by law but by practical circumstance. They could not afford to take time away from labor. They lacked the education to speak persuasively in assemblies. They had no leisure to cultivate the relationships and alliances that drove political success. Democracy in practice became ruled by those who had the resources to participate, which meant ruled by those who were not actually poor, even if they were not wealthy. Archaeological evidence confirms the literary accounts. Skeletal remains show signs of nutritional deficiency, bone diseases related to poor diet, and injuries from repetitive labor. The average height of ancient Greeks was shorter than modern populations, partly due to inadequate childhood nutrition. Tooth decay and loss were common, a result of limited access to protein and the grinding ware of coarse bread made from stone-ground grain. Housing for the poor was cramped and inadequate. Small mud brick structures with minimal furnishing. No running water, which meant long walks to public wells. No sewage system, which meant waste disposal was a constant problem. Multiple families sometimes shared single rooms. Privacy was non-existent. In winter, heating was minimal. In summer, the heat was oppressive. These were not homes in any comfortable sense. They were shelters, barely adequate to keep rain and sun at bay. This was the daily reality for the majority of Greeks. Not philosophy and art, not democracy and debate, but hunger, exhaustion, and the constant grind of trying to stay alive in a world that offered them little and demanded much. The glory of Greece rested on their bent backs and empty stomachs. The cruel mathematics of poverty in ancient Greece created an invisible wall around democracy itself. On paper, in theory, any male citizen could participate in Athenian political life, could speak in the assembly, could vote on laws, could serve on juries, could even hold certain offices chosen by lottery. The system claimed to be open to all citizens regardless of wealth. Reality told a different story. The assembly met frequently, sometimes multiple times per month. Sessions could last hours. A poor man attending the assembly lost a day of wages. If he was a day laborer, that meant his family ate less that week. If he was a small farmer, that meant work piled up, crops went untended, and the next harvest might be smaller. The democracy asked him to sacrifice his family's immediate well-being for the abstract good of political participation. Jury service presented a similar dilemma. Athens used large citizen juries, sometimes hundreds of jurors for a single case. Service was paid, but the payment was modest, calculated to cover basic expenses rather than lost wages. A skilled craftsman or successful merchant actually lost money by serving. A poor citizen might break even at best. The system functioned as a subtle filter, discouraging those who most needed every obelisk from participating in civic life. The assembly did eventually introduce payment for attendance, recognizing this problem. But the payment remained small, barely enough to compensate for lost work time. And it came late in Athenian history, after democracy had already been functioning for generations. For most of the classical period, political participation was effectively a luxury the poor could ill afford. Even more fundamental was the barrier of education and confidence. Speaking in the assembly required skill. You had to know the issues, had to understand political context, had to speak persuasively before hundreds or thousands of men, many of whom were educated and wealthy. Poor citizens who spent their days hauling cargo or working fields rarely developed these abilities. They lacked the training and rhetoric that wealthy boys received. They lacked the confidence that comes from a lifetime of being listened to and respected. The result was predictable. Wealthy and middle-class citizens dominated political discourse. They had the time to attend regularly. They had the education to speak effectively. They had the social connections to build coalitions and influence. They understood how to navigate the unwritten rules of political life. Poor citizens might show up for crucial votes, might make their voices heard on issues that directly affected them, but they were never equal participants in the democratic process. This exclusion had philosophical justification. Aristotle, the most influential political thinker of the ancient world, explicitly argued that some people were natural slaves, lacking the rational capacity for self-governance. While he meant this primarily about actual slaves, the logic extended easily to the poor. If poverty resulted from lack of virtue or capability, then perhaps poor citizens were not truly fit for political participation either. The wealthy could tell themselves they were serving the common good by dominating politics, that they were better equipped to make wise decisions. The poor understood their position. They knew the system was not truly designed for them. Some historians argue this knowledge itself acted as a deterrent. Why waste a day at the assembly when wealthy citizens would dominate the discussion anyway? Why try to speak when you lacked the education and polish to be taken seriously? Better to focus on survival, on feeding your family, on getting through each day as it came. Occasionally, populist leaders arose who claimed to represent poor citizens against elite interests. Cleon in Athens became infamous among the wealthy as a demagogue, a leader who supposedly manipulated the common people for personal gain. Reading between the lines of hostile accounts written by elite authors, we can see that Cleon likely gave voice to grievances the poor actually felt. He pushed for policies that would benefit ordinary citizens. He challenged the aristocratic assumption that wealthy men should naturally lead, and he was hated for it by the writers whose accounts survived to us. The contempt directed at Cleon reveals the real attitudes of the privileged classes. Democracy was fine as long as it remained in the right hands, as long as educated, wealthy men made the key decisions, as long as the poor knew their place. When someone actually tried to shift power toward ordinary citizens, when democracy threatened to become something more than a forum for elite debate, the backlash was fierce. Religious festivals provided one of the few contexts where poor citizens could participate relatively equally in civic life. These events occurred throughout the year. They involved processions, sacrifices, feasting, and entertainment. The city provided meat from sacrificed animals, one of the rare occasions when poor Athenians could eat beef or pork. The festivals were public, open to all citizens, and central to communal identity. But even here, inequality marked the experience. Wealthy citizens paid for lavish elements of festivals, gaining honor and prestige. They led processions. They sponsored dramatic performances. They provided animals for sacrifice. Their generosity was public and celebrated. Poor citizens attended and benefited, certainly, but always as recipients of elite generosity rather than as equal participants in civic religion. The geographic reality of Athens reinforced social divisions. The city itself was relatively compact, but many citizens lived in rural areas of Attica, the region surrounding Athens. For farmers living a day's walk from the city, attending the assembly was not a matter of a few hours but of multiple days away from home. They would need to arrange for someone to watch their property, care for their animals, manage their household. The practical barriers made regular participation nearly impossible. Sparta handled this differently through its unique system. Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, did not work at all. They devoted themselves entirely to military training and civic duties. The Helots, state-owned slaves, did all productive labor. This freed Spartan citizens to participate fully in their political system. But it also meant Spartan society rested on even more brutal exploitation than Athens. The Helots lived in constant terror. The Spartans maintained control through systematic violence, including ritual murders of Helot leaders. Other Greek city-states had their own variations, but the pattern held. Genuine political participation required resources, time, education, confidence, social connections. These things were not distributed equally. Democracy in practice meant rule by those who could afford to rule. The poor might have theoretical rights, but exercising those rights was another matter entirely. Hippocrates, the famous physician, observed this reality with clinical precision. He noted that poor people did not have time to exercise their profession as citizens. They were consumed with finding food and shelter. Every waking moment went to survival. How could such people deliberate on matters of war and peace? How could they judge complex legal cases? How could they debate the finer points of public policy? They could not, and everyone knew it. This was perhaps the deepest hardship poverty imposed in ancient Greece. Not just hunger and exhaustion, though those were real enough, but exclusion from the very identity that defined Greek civilization. The Greeks proudly distinguished themselves from barbarians partly through their political systems, their self-governance, their reasoned debate. Poor citizens were Greek, yet they could not fully participate in the thing that made Greekness meaningful. They were politically castrated by economic necessity, and they had no way out. No social mobility. No path from poverty to prosperity. No programs to help them escape their circumstances. They were trapped, and their children would be trapped, in a system that claimed to value all citizens while structuring itself to benefit only some. Slavery was not a footnote in ancient Greek society. It was the foundation, the economic engine, the invisible labor force that made everything else possible. Without slavery, Greek civilization as we know it could not have existed. The philosophy, the art, the democracy, all of it depended on enslaved people performing the work that free citizens refused to do. The scale is staggering. In Athens during the 5th century, historians estimate that slaves comprised 30 to 40% of the total population. Some scholars argue the proportion could have been even higher. We are talking about 75,000 to 100,000 enslaved people in a single city-state. In Sparta with its helot system, enslaved people outnumbered free citizens by ratios of 20 to 1. Walk through the streets of ancient Athens and 1 in 3 people you passed was enslaved. Every 4th or 5th household owned at least 1 slave. Wealthy families owned dozens. The richest Athenians owned hundreds. The strategos Nicias leased 1,000 slaves to work the silver mines of Laurion. Hipponicus leased 600. These were not exceptional cases. They represented the upper end of a system where slave ownership was normal across all economic classes except the absolutely destitute. Even poor citizens typically owned 1 or 2 slaves if they could possibly afford it. A single slave might cost 200 drachmas, roughly equivalent to 2/3 of a year's wage for a skilled worker. It was a significant investment, but one that paid returns through the slave's labor. Only the most impoverished citizens lacked slaves entirely. Where did all these slaves come from? War was the primary source. When Greek city-states fought each other, the victors claimed the defeated as property. This was standard practice, accepted as the natural right of conquest. When Athens conquered the island of Melos during the Peloponnesian War, they killed all the adult men and enslaved the women and children. When Thebes fell to Alexander the Great, 30,000 people were sold into slavery. These were not soldiers. They were civilians. Entire populations swept into bondage. Piracy provided another steady stream. The Mediterranean was infested with pirates who raided coastal settlements specifically to capture people for sale. They targeted isolated villages, small islands, merchant ships. Anyone they caught became merchandise. The line between legitimate naval warfare and piracy was thin. International trade in human beings flourished. The island of Delos hosted one of the largest slave markets in the ancient world. Traders brought enslaved people from all over the Mediterranean and beyond, from Thrace and Scythia to the north, from Asia Minor to the east, from North Africa to the south. People of every ethnicity could be found for sale. Children born to enslaved mothers automatically became slaves themselves. This created a self-perpetuating system. If your mother was enslaved when she gave birth to you, you were enslaved from your first breath. You inherited her status along with nothing else. Some enslaved people in Athens had lived there for generations, born into families that had been enslaved for decades. Debt bondage existed, though less common after Solon's reforms prohibited enslaving Athenian citizens for debt. But this protection applied only to citizens. Foreigners could still be enslaved for unpaid debts. And in times of desperation, parents sometimes sold their own children into slavery to survive. Kidnapping added to the numbers. Professional kidnappers operated throughout the Greek world, snatching vulnerable people and selling them to slave dealers. Children playing outside their homes, women traveling alone. Anyone without protection could vanish into the slave trade. The sheer ordinariness of slavery is perhaps most disturbing. It was not questioned by mainstream society. The greatest philosophers accepted it as natural. Aristotle explicitly defended it, arguing that some people were natural slaves, lacking the capacity to govern themselves. Slavery was woven into every aspect of Greek economic life. Agriculture depended on it, manufacturing depended on it, mining depended on it, domestic labor depended on it. Even the state employed slaves for public works and administrative roles. The entire system would have collapsed without enslaved labor. In our popular understanding of ancient Greece, slavery often appears as a minor detail. We focus on the achievements of free citizens while glossing over the human cost. We celebrate democracy while forgetting it functioned only because enslaved people had no voice. We admire philosophy while ignoring that philosophers had leisure to think because slaves did their work. The numbers tell the truth. 75,000 to 100,000 enslaved people in Athens alone, hundreds of thousands across the Greek world, millions over the centuries, each one a human being reduced to property, used as tools, traded as commodities. Their suffering was the price of Greek glory. Not all slaves in ancient Greece suffered equally. The conditions of enslavement varied dramatically depending on where you worked, who owned you, and what skills you possessed. This created a hierarchy even within slavery itself, a spectrum of misery ranging from merely oppressive to absolutely horrific. Domestic slaves often had the best circumstances, relatively speaking. They worked in private households, performing cooking, cleaning, childcare, and personal service. In wealthy homes, they might live in decent quarters, eat adequate food, and develop personal relationships with the family. Some became trusted household managers or tutored children. This relative comfort was fragile. A domestic slave lived at the mercy of their owner's temperament. A kind master might treat them well. A cruel one could make their life torture. Women enslaved in households faced constant sexual vulnerability. Masters could assault female slaves without consequence. The children born from these violations became slaves themselves. Even in the best circumstances, domestic slaves had no freedom. They could not leave, could not refuse orders, could not protect themselves from punishment. They were possessions that happened to be human. Agricultural slaves worked at the farms that fed Greek society. On small farms with 1 or 2 slaves, the work was hard. But slaves might labor alongside their owner, sharing meals and enduring the same weather. Large estates were different. Wealthy landowners might own dozens or hundreds of agricultural slaves who worked under overseers. These slaves lived in separate quarters and had minimal contact with the property owner. They were anonymous labor units, worked as hard as possible. The whip enforced discipline. Branding marked runaways. The work was brutal. Plowing rocky soil from sunrise to sunset, harvesting grain under blazing sun. Every task required backbreaking effort. Agricultural slaves aged rapidly. Their bodies wore out. When they became too weak to work effectively, they had little value. Slaves in workshops and manufacturing learned skilled trades like pottery or metalworking. This specialized knowledge gave them some value. A skilled craftsman slave was worth more than an unskilled laborer and might receive marginally better treatment. Some workshop slaves lived separately from their masters and earned small wages. The master took most earnings, but the slave kept a portion. Over many years, an enslaved craftsman might save enough to purchase his freedom. This was uncommon but possible. Public slaves, owned by the city-state, had unique circumstances. Athens employed several hundred in various capacities. They maintained roads and aqueducts. They served as clerks in government offices. These positions offered more stability than private slavery. The state generally provided adequate food and shelter, but they were still property, still subject to punishment, still slaves. Then there were the mine slaves. If there was a hell in ancient Greece, it existed underground in the silver mines of Laurion. These mines produced the wealth that funded Athenian power. The fleet that defeated Persia was built with silver dug by enslaved people working in conditions almost beyond description. Mine slaves worked in tunnels so narrow they had to crawl. The air was thick with dust that destroyed lungs. Temperatures were extreme. Lighting came from small oil lamps producing more smoke than illumination. Cave-ins were common. Flooding happened regularly. Ventilation was minimal. They worked in shifts, sometimes around the clock. They slept in crowded barracks near the mines, chained at night. Food was minimal. Medical care was non-existent. Injuries were common. Death was frequent. The survival rate was horrific. A slave sent to Laurion might last months or a few years at most. The mine owners had little incentive to preserve their health. When a slave died, another could be purchased. During the Peloponnesian War, more than 20,000 slaves escaped from Athens when the Spartans established a nearby fort. Most were mine slaves. They risked death to flee, which tells us everything about their conditions. Quarry slaves faced similar horrors. Stone for Athens' famous buildings was cut by enslaved people using primitive tools to extract massive blocks. Ropes and wooden rollers moved stones, weighing tons. Accidents crushed bodies. The work destroyed backs and joints. The hierarchy of slavery created divisions among the enslaved. Domestic slaves looked down on agricultural slaves. Skilled craftsmen considered themselves superior to common laborers. All feared being sent to the mines. These divisions made collective resistance difficult. Slaves had little reason to feel solidarity. This was intentional. By creating different categories and conditions, owners gave slaves reason to comply. A domestic slave would work to avoid being sold to a mine operator. The system used hope and fear to maintain itself. Yet all shared the fundamental condition: property, not persons. Subject to being bought, sold, traded, or inherited. Whatever small privileges some enjoyed could vanish instantly. They were never safe, never secure, never free. The legal status of slaves in ancient Greece was brutally simple. They were things, not people, property under the law. An enslaved person had no rights that a citizen was bound to respect, no protection from violence, no recourse against injustice, no voice in their own fate. Owners could beat their slaves freely. Whipping was the standard method of discipline and punishment. Household slaves might be whipped for burning dinner, for speaking out of turn, for moving too slowly. Agricultural slaves faced the whip for failing to meet work quotas. The threat of physical violence hung over every moment. The Greeks did not hide this brutality. It was open and normalized. Aristotle wrote that slaves were living tools. The playwright Menander joked about beating slaves in his comedies, treating violence against enslaved people as humor for free audiences. The whip was simply how you managed property that could think and feel. Branding and tattooing marked slaves permanently. If you ran away and were caught, your owner might brand your face with hot iron. The scar identified you forever as a slave and a runaway. Some owners tattooed their slaves with ownership marks. These marks could never be removed. They destroyed any possibility of passing as free. Chains and fetters confined slaves considered flight risks. Iron shackles around ankles, collars around necks. Some slaves spent years in chains, their skin rubbed raw, their movements restricted even while they worked. The weight of the iron was a constant reminder of their status. Sexual violence against enslaved people was routine and legal. Masters could assault their slaves without consequence. The children produced by these violations became the master's property. Enslaved women had no right to refuse sexual demands. Bodies were property. Consent was irrelevant. The sexual exploitation of slaves was so common that Greek literature barely mentions it. Torture of slaves was legal in judicial proceedings. When an enslaved person gave testimony in court, the law required that testimony be extracted under torture. The Greeks believed slaves would lie unless physically compelled to tell the truth. Enslaved people could be stretched on racks, beaten, burned, subjected to various instruments of pain, all in the name of justice. Execution of slaves was entirely legal. An owner could kill their slave for any reason or no reason at all. There might be social pressure not to kill slaves without cause, as they represented financial investment, but there was no legal prohibition, no trial required, no justification needed. The concept scholars call social death describes the condition of slaves in ancient Greece. They were alienated from their birthplace, their culture, their families. When you were enslaved through war or piracy or kidnapping, you were torn from everything that had given your life meaning. Your name might be changed, your language forbidden, your religion suppressed. You were severed from your past and given no future except continued servitude. This natal alienation was deliberate. It made resistance more difficult. If you had no connection to other slaves, no shared language or culture, no basis for trust, you were less likely to organize rebellion. The Greeks enslaved people from all over the Mediterranean specifically to create this diversity and isolation. Slaves had no family rights. If you formed a relationship with another slave, it existed only at your owner's pleasure. Your partner could be sold away at any moment. Your children belonged to your master, not to you. They could be sold separately. You might watch your infant taken from your arms and handed to a stranger, never to be seen again. Manumission, the formal freeing of slaves, did occur but was rare. Some slaves earned enough money over many years to purchase their freedom. Some owners freed favored slaves in their wills, but the numbers were small. Most slaves died as slaves. Freedom was a distant dream, not a realistic expectation. Even freed slaves did not gain full equality. They became freedmen, a separate legal category with fewer rights than citizens. They often owed continued obligations to their former masters. The stain of slavery followed them. The escape was serious. Running away was a direct challenge to the property system. Runaways who were caught faced brutal punishment designed to deter others. Public whipping, branding, being sold to the mines. Professional slave catchers made a living hunting escaped slaves. Organized rebellion was rare in ancient Greece. The structure of slavery, with its diversity of origins and conditions, made collective action difficult. But the absence of major rebellions did not mean acceptance. It meant the system of control was effective. Yet slaves remained human. They loved, they hoped, they formed bonds despite all obstacles. They found ways to maintain dignity in undignified circumstances. They preserved memories of freedom, of home, of who they had been. They sang songs in their native languages when out of hearing. They told their children stories of their homeland. They resisted in small ways that could not be detected. This was the daily reality of slavery in ancient Greece, the lived experience of hundreds of thousands of human beings reduced to property, subject to violence, stripped of rights, yet somehow surviving, somehow remaining human despite a system designed to deny their humanity. If you were born female in ancient Greece, your life was determined before you took your first breath. Your worth was conditional. Your rights were non-existent. Your future was not yours to decide. You belonged first to your father, then to your husband, then to your sons. You were never your own person. The legal framework was explicit. Every woman in ancient Greece lived under the authority of a kurios, a male guardian. This was not optional. It was absolute and universal. A woman could not act independently in legal matters, could not represent herself in court, could not make contracts, could not buy or sell property without her kurios acting on her behalf. The kurios system meant that women were perpetual legal minors. Even if you were 40 years old, intelligent and capable, you had no more legal standing than a child. You needed a man to conduct business for you, to speak for you, to make decisions on your behalf. Athens, celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, treated its female citizens with particular severity. Women there could not vote, could not attend the assembly, could not hold public office, could not speak in public forums. Their names were not supposed to be mentioned in public at all, whether in praise or criticism. To be a respectable woman in Athens meant being invisible. The physical restriction was even more striking. Women in Athens were largely confined to their homes. They could not leave without their husband's permission, could not visit neighbors freely, could not walk through the city at will. The house itself was divided, with women occupying separate quarters, often at the back or on upper floors, away from areas where men might receive visitors. Wealthy women faced the strictest confinement. They had slaves to do the shopping, to fetch water, to run errands. They might go months without leaving their homes except for specific religious festivals. Their pale skin, resulting from lack of sun exposure, was considered a mark of virtue and beauty. It proved they had stayed indoors as proper women should. Women ate separately from men. When the household hosted male guests, women retreated to their quarters. They were not part of the conversation, not welcome at the symposiums where men drank and debated. Their world was bounded by walls. Education for girls reflected their expected roles. They learned household management, weaving and spinning. Basic literacy perhaps, enough to manage household accounts. But there was no intellectual development encouraged, no philosophy, no rhetoric. A woman's mind was not meant to be cultivated. It was meant to serve practical domestic needs. Marriage was not a choice but an inevitability. Girls were married young, typically between 12 and 15 years old. They had no say in selecting their husband. Marriages were arranged between the girl's father and her future husband. She might not meet her husband until the wedding day. She was transferred from one man's authority to another's like property changing hands. The age gap was often significant. A 12-year-old girl might be married to a man in his 30s. She was expected to manage his household, bear his children, and submit to his authority in all things. Romantic love was not a consideration. Marriage was about producing legitimate heirs and forming alliances between families. Pregnancy and childbirth were women's primary functions. A wife was expected to produce sons. Daughters were less valued. The pressure to bear male children was immense. Women who could not conceive, or who only produced daughters, faced social shame and possible divorce. Childbirth itself was extremely dangerous. Medical understanding was limited. Many women died in childbirth or from postpartum complications. It was perhaps the greatest risk a woman faced, yet it was unavoidable. Refusing to bear children was not an option. A woman's body was not her own. Even successful childbirth did not guarantee a mother's authority over her children. Children belonged to the father. He decided whether to keep or expose newborns. He controlled their upbringing. If he divorced their mother, the children remained with him. A woman could give birth to and raise children yet have no legal claim to them. Divorce was possible but asymmetrical. A man could divorce his wife relatively easily. A woman could not initiate divorce herself. She needed her kurios to act on her behalf. Adultery by a wife was grounds for mandatory divorce. Adultery by a husband was expected and socially acceptable. Property rights revealed the depth of women's legal powerlessness. In most Greek city-states, Women could not own land, could not inherit property directly. If a father died with no sons, his daughter became an epikleros, but she could not control the inheritance herself. She and the property were packaged dealt to her nearest male relative. The language used to describe women reflected their status. Aristotle declared that men were naturally superior and women naturally inferior. The playwright Hipponax wrote that there were 2 happy days a woman brings a man. The first when he marries her, the second when he bears her to the grave. This was humor in ancient Greece. Sparta was notably different. Spartan women could own property, could drink wine, could exercise physically. They were respected as mothers of warriors. But even in Sparta, women could not vote or hold office. Even in Sparta, they were subordinate to men. The restrictions on women's lives were comprehensive. Political exclusion, legal disability, physical confinement, educational limitation, economic dependence, social invisibility. From birth to death, a woman in ancient Greece lived in chains that were invisible but unbreakable. The wedding ceremony that transformed a girl into a wife was not a celebration of her desires. It was a transaction finalized with ritual. The bride wore special garments and a veil. She was transported from her father's house to her husband's house in a procession. At the threshold of her new home, she crossed from one form of captivity into another. On her wedding night, a girl as young as 12 might be expected to consummate the marriage with a man she barely knew, who might be twice her age or older. There was no consideration of her readiness, her fear, her consent. Her body now belonged to her husband. The purpose of this early marriage was clear. Girls were wed young to ensure virginity and to maximize their childbearing years. A woman married at 12 or 13 could potentially produce children for 20 years or more. Female bodies as reproductive vessels, put into service as early as biology allowed. Inside the marriage, a woman's day revolved around domestic labor. Even wealthy women supervised complex household operations, managing slaves, organizing food preparation, overseeing weaving and cloth production. Every Greek household produced its own textiles, and this was women's work. The click of the loom was the soundtrack of female life. Weaving was not optional, it was essential. Clothing for the entire family had to be produced at home. This meant processing raw wool or flax, spinning thread, setting up looms, weaving cloth. The process was time-consuming and never-ending. Women's hands were always busy with fiber and thread. For poor women, the restrictions were different but no less severe. They could not afford to stay home. They had to work. They might sell goods in markets, might work as wet nurses, might labor in fields. But even while working outside the home, they remained under male authority. The work was necessity, not freedom. The double standard regarding sexuality was absolute. A husband could have sexual relations with slaves, prostitutes, or other men without social consequences. A wife was required to be faithful absolutely. Any sexual activity outside marriage was grounds for immediate divorce and social destruction. Her virtue was the family's honor. His behavior was irrelevant. If a woman committed adultery, her husband was required by law to divorce her. She would be banned from public religious ceremonies, marked for life. Her reputation destroyed. The man who committed adultery with her faced far less severe consequences. Motherhood was supposed to be a woman's greatest achievement, yet it came with constant anxiety. Would she conceive? Would she carry to term? Would she survive childbirth? Would the baby be healthy? Would it be male? Each pregnancy was a gamble with her life and her social position. The infant mortality rate was staggering. Many babies died within their first year. Mothers nursed children knowing that disease or accident could take them at any moment. The emotional toll of repeated loss must have been crushing, yet it was considered normal. Even when children survived, a mother's bond with them was not protected. If her husband chose to expose a newborn, she could not stop him. If he divorced her, the children stayed with him. Motherhood gave a woman no legal claim to her own offspring. Women's exclusion from public life was reinforced through prohibition from major civic events. Married women could not attend the Olympic Games. The penalty for a married woman caught at the Olympics was death. Though scholars debate whether this was ever enforced, the message was clear. These spaces were for men. Religious festivals provided one of the few acceptable reasons for women to leave their homes. Certain festivals were exclusively for women, particularly the Thesmophoria, a fertility festival. For a few days, women gathered without men present. They performed rituals, they socialized. These occasions were rare and precious. Some women served as priestesses, holding religious offices that gave them public roles. The Pythia at Delphi was a woman. Priestesses of Athena held important positions. These roles show that Greek society recognized women's religious significance. even while denying them political power. Women's voices are largely absent from surviving Greek literature. Most texts were written by men for male audiences. We have fragments from Sappho, the poet from Lesbos, whose work speaks of female desire, but she is nearly alone. The vast majority of Greek literature presents women as men saw them, not as they saw themselves. When women appear in literature, they often represent extremes. The faithful Penelope waiting decades for Odysseus, the murderous Medea, the seductive Helen. These are not realistic portraits but male fantasies and fears projected onto female characters. Philosophy offered little help. Plato suggested women could be guardians in his ideal city, but this was theoretical. Aristotle was explicit in his belief in female inferiority. He argued that women were incomplete men, naturally suited to be ruled. The cumulative effect of these restrictions was the erasure of women from public consciousness. They were necessary for reproduction. They managed households. They produced textiles. They raised children. Their labor made male civic participation possible, yet they were invisible in the democracy they enabled, silent in the philosophy they supported, absent from the history they helped create. One of the most disturbing aspects of life in ancient Greece involves the treatment of newborn children. The practice known as exposure, or infant abandonment, raises questions that scholars still debate. How common was it? Who were the victims? What motivated parents to abandon their own children? The most famous account comes from Plutarch, writing around 100 CE about events that supposedly occurred 700 years earlier. He described Spartan practice in vivid detail. When a child was born, it was taken to the elders of the tribe. These old men examined the infant. They deemed it fit and strong. The child was accepted. If they found it weak or deformed, the baby was taken to a Apothetea chasm on Mount Tegetos and left to die. This image has haunted the modern imagination. Cold-hearted elders inspecting babies and condemning the weak to death captures something we find both fascinating and repellent about ancient Sparta. It fits our view of Spartans as brutal and militaristic. But there is a problem with Plutarch's account. He was writing centuries after the events he described. He had no direct knowledge. Recent archaeological investigations found something interesting. The alleged site of infant exposure on Tegetos contains human remains, but they are adult males, not infants. The physical evidence does not support Plutarch's claim. Moreover, Plutarch himself provides contradictory evidence. He mentions King Agesilaus II of Sparta, who was notably short and had impaired legs. Yet Agesilaus was not killed as an infant. He became king. If Sparta truly killed all deformed infants, how did a lame boy survive and thrive? A recent study by archaeologist Debbie Sneed argues that abandoning disabled infants was not standard practice in ancient Greece. Sneed points to various evidence. Greek medical texts from around 400 BCE advise physicians on treating adults born with physical impairments. Skeletal remains of children with severe medical conditions show evidence of care. Pottery remains include special feeding bottles, some with teeth marks, indicating Greeks cared for infants who had difficulty nursing. One striking case involves remains found in a well in Athens. Among more than 400 infant skeletons, excavators found a child aged 6 to 8 months who had severe hypotension. This child had a visibly enlarged head and required significant care, yet the family kept this baby alive for months. Someone fed this child, someone chose care over abandonment. However, other scholars remain skeptical. Christian Lies of the University of Manchester argues that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we have not found infant remains at exposure sites does not mean exposure did not occur. He points to ethnographic studies of other societies where infant abandonment was practiced but left little archaeological trace. The debate highlights how difficult it is to know the truth about ancient practices that left little direct evidence. We have literary sources, but they were often written long after events. We have archaeological evidence, but it is incomplete. We are trying to understand the intimate family decisions of people who lived thousands of years ago. What we can say with more certainty is that exposure, when it occurred, was more likely to target girls than boys. The comic playwright Postidippus stated this explicitly. Everyone raises a son even if he is poor, but exposes a daughter even if he is rich. This was not about disability, it was about gender. Daughters were less valued, they required dowries. They did not carry on the family name. Sons were investments. Daughters were expenses. Some scholars believe exposure functioned as a form of birth control in a world without effective contraception. Families could not afford to raise every child. Abandoning newborns, particularly girls, limited family size to what parents could support. The practice was passive in the sense that parents did not directly kill the child but left it in a public place where it might be found. There is evidence that some exposed infants were rescued. Slave traders collected abandoned babies and raised them to be sold. Childless families adopted foundlings. Greek mythology is filled with stories of exposed children who survive. These narratives suggest that exposure was not always fatal, but this does not soften the cruelty. A baby left outside faced death from exposure to elements, from starvation, from animal attack. Parents who abandoned infants knew these outcomes were likely, and the babies who did survive exposure often became slaves. The practice, whether common or rare, reflects something fundamental about Greek society. Children were not considered inherently valuable. Their worth was conditional. A child had to be accepted by the father and community to have a place in society. Until that acceptance occurred, the newborn existed in a liminal state. The ceremony held 5 days after birth, when the child was formally named and accepted into the family, marked the transition from potential person to actual person. Before that ceremony, the infant could be abandoned legally and without social stigma. The controversy over infant exposure will likely continue. New evidence may emerge, but what remains clear is that Greek society, for all its achievements, did not guarantee every newborn the right to live. The fact that exposure was legal and socially acceptable tells us something important about the hardships of living in that world. Disease was a constant shadow over ancient Greek life. In a world without understanding of germ theory, without antibiotics, without modern sanitation, epidemics swept through cities with terrifying speed. The Greeks attributed disease to divine displeasure, to bad air, to bodily imbalances. They were wrong about the causes, and their treatments were often ineffective or harmful. The most famous epidemic is the Plague of Athens, which struck during the Peloponnesian War. In 430 BCE, as Spartan armies besieged Athens, a mysterious disease appeared. It would kill an estimated 25% of the population over the next few years. Among the dead was Pericles, the great Athenian statesman. Thucydides, the historian, survived the plague and left a detailed account. He described symptoms that began in the head: reddening and burning of eyes, inflammation of throat, sneezing, hoarseness, a cough, chest pain, powerful vomiting. The skin broke out in pustules and ulcers. Internal fever was so intense that sufferers could not bear even the lightest clothing. They threw themselves into cold water seeking relief. Thirst was unquenchable. Death usually came after 7 days. Those who survived the initial phase often suffered complications. Gangrene attacked the extremities. Fingers and toes blackened and fell off. Some lost their sight, others lost their memory completely. The disease was merciless and seemingly random. The plague arrived at the worst possible time. Pericles had convinced Athenians to abandon the countryside and retreat behind the city walls. The rural population crowded into Athens. People slept in temples, in makeshift shelters, in any available space. Sanitation was overwhelmed. The city became dangerously overcrowded just as a deadly epidemic emerged. The overcrowding accelerated the disease's spread. Whatever pathogen caused the plague found ideal conditions: close quarters, poor hygiene, stress and malnutrition from war. Bodies piled up because there were not enough healthy people to bury the dead. Traditional funeral rites broke down. People placed their dead on funeral pyres meant for others. The social breakdown was as catastrophic as the physical suffering. Fear replaced community bonds. People avoided the sick, even close relatives. Those who did care for the ill usually caught the disease and died. The plague seemed to punish compassion. Social order collapsed. Laws lost their force. No one expected to live long enough to face consequences. Religious observations ceased when the gods seemed deaf to prayers. Thucydides left this account so the disease could be recognized if it returned. Scholars have been trying to identify the plague ever since. Typhus is currently the leading candidate. The symptoms match reasonably well. Typhus spreads through lice and thrives in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. It has a mortality rate of around 20%. The 7-day timeline fits. The gangrene is consistent with severe typhus, but we cannot be certain. Some scholars have proposed typhoid fever. Others suggest smallpox or measles. The plague of Athens may have been a disease that no longer exists in recognizable form. What we do know is that the plague devastated Athens at a critical moment. It killed military and political leaders. It destroyed morale and social cohesion. The Spartans, camped outside the walls, were mysteriously untouched. Some Athenians believed their enemies had poisoned the water. The random cruelty fed paranoia and despair. The plague of Athens was not unique. Throughout Greek history, epidemics appeared. Tuberculosis, known as typhus, ravaged communities. The Greeks described it as a living body shriveling with intense heat as if placed in flame. We know now it is a bacterial infection. In antiquity, it was a slow death sentence. Victims wasted away over months or years, coughing blood, growing weaker until they died. Malaria plagued the Greek world. The disease is caused by parasites transmitted by mosquitoes. Swampy areas were particularly dangerous. The Greeks and Romans used mosquito netting, showing they understood some connection between insects and disease, but they could not prevent or cure malaria. It caused recurring fevers, chills, and weakness. The ancient world also knew diarrheal diseases. Contaminated water and food caused dysentery and cholera. In a world without clean water systems, without refrigeration, without understanding of sanitation, these diseases were common. They killed quickly, especially the young and old. Cancer existed in ancient Greece. Hippocrates described it using the Greek word karcinoma, which meant crab, because tumors clung to tissue like a crab with its claws. The Greeks knew that cancer could spread. They performed mastectomies, but they had no effective treatments. Life expectancy was low. Some wealthy men lived into their 70s, but the overall average was much lower, possibly in the 30s or 40s, dragged down by horrific infant and childhood mortality. Perhaps half of children did not survive to adulthood. Disease killed them, accidents killed them, malnutrition weakened them. Parents expected to bury some of their children. This was normal. This was the background reality of life in ancient Greece. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman in ancient Greece could face. Modern maternal mortality is measured in deaths per 100,000 births. In ancient Greece, it was likely measured in deaths per 100 births. Pregnancy and childbirth killed women at rates that would horrify us today. The Greeks had no understanding of infection, no concept of sterility, no effective pain management. Midwives attended births, women with experience but no formal medical training. When complications arose, they had few tools and little knowledge to help. Prolonged labor could kill both mother and child. If the baby was positioned wrong, if the pelvis was too narrow, if bleeding could not be stopped, death followed. Some midwives attempted to turn babies manually or used instruments to extract stuck infants. These interventions often caused more harm, tearing tissue, introducing infection, causing hemorrhage. Infection after childbirth, what we now call puerperal fever, killed countless new mothers. Women would survive the birth itself only to develop fever days later. The infection spread through their bodies. Within a week they were dead, leaving a newborn without a mother. The Greeks had no antibiotics. They could only watch. Young mothers faced additional risks. Girls married and became pregnant at 12, 13, 14 years old. Their bodies were not fully developed. Their pelvises had not finished growing. In ancient Greece, those risks were compounded by poor nutrition, lack of medical knowledge, and the expectation that girls should bear children as soon as they were biologically capable. The infant mortality rate was staggering. Perhaps 40 to 50% of children died before reaching adulthood. Some died within hours of birth, some within days, some within their first year, some in early childhood from disease or accident. Parents could not assume their children would survive. Many infants died from causes we now prevent routinely: infections of the umbilical cord, respiratory distress, dehydration from diarrhea, complications from premature birth. All of these were death sentences in the ancient world. Malnutrition contributed to infant and childhood mortality. Mothers who were themselves malnourished produced less breast milk. Babies who did not get adequate nutrition failed to thrive. They became weak. Their immune systems could not fight infections. Simple illnesses killed malnourished infants. Weaning was a dangerous transition. When babies moved from breast milk to solid food, they suddenly faced exposure to contaminated water and food. Diarrheal diseases killed children rapidly through dehydration. Without clean water, without understanding how disease spread, parents unknowingly poisoned their own children with food and water that looked safe. Childhood diseases that we consider minor killed thousands. Measles, mumps, whooping cough, scarlet fever. These diseases spread easily through communities. They killed young children whose immune systems could not mount effective defenses. Parents watched helplessly as fever consumed their children. They tried herbal remedies. They prayed. Nothing worked. Accidents claimed many young lives. Children fell from heights, drowned in wells or rivers, were kicked by animals, burned in cooking fires. Greek houses were not child-proofed. The world was full of dangers. A moment of inattention could end a child's life. The wealthy had some advantages: better nutrition, more comfortable housing, but wealth could not prevent most childhood diseases. could not guarantee a safe childbirth, could not protect against epidemics. Rich children died at lower rates than poor children, but they still died in numbers we would find unacceptable. Large families were necessary partly because so many children would not survive. If you wanted two adult sons to carry on the family name and support you in old age, you might need to produce 6 children. This was not cruelty but mathematics. The arithmetic of survival in a high mortality environment. The elderly faced their own hardships. There was no retirement, no social security. If you survived through old age, you depended entirely on your children. Childless elderly people, or those whose children had died, faced destitution, begging, starvation, death from neglect. Old age brought physical decline that could not be treated. Arthritis made movement painful. Failing eyesight meant you could not work. Lost teeth meant you could not eat many foods. Dementia robbed people of their memories. The Greeks had no nursing homes, no specialized care for the elderly. Medical knowledge was primitive. Hippocrates and other physicians made important observations, but they lacked the tools and knowledge to save most patients. Surgery was crude and often fatal due to infection and blood loss. Herbal remedies sometimes helped, but just as often did nothing. Pain management did not exist beyond alcohol and a few plant-based substances. Surgery was performed on conscious patients who had to be physically restrained. The agony must have been unimaginable. Many patients died from shock. Those who survived often died from subsequent infection. This was the reality behind the philosophical achievements. While Plato wrote about ideal forms and Sophocles composed tragedies, babies were dying by the thousands. Women were dying in childbirth. Children were dying from preventable diseases. Death was everywhere, touching every family, claiming victims from every social class. War was not an occasional disruption in ancient Greece. It was a constant presence. The Greek world was fractured into hundreds of independent city-states, each with its own interests, alliances, and ambitions. Conflict between these states was almost continuous. Peace was the exception. War was the norm. The Peloponnesian War stands as the defining conflict of classical Greece. It lasted 27 years. From 431 to 404 BCE, it involved virtually every Greek city-state. It killed tens of thousands of soldiers. It killed even more civilians. It destroyed entire cities. It shattered the Greek world and changed it forever. The war began because Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful city-states, could not coexist peacefully. Athens dominated the sea. It controlled a vast maritime empire through the Delian League. Member cities paid tribute to Athens. Some paid willingly, others were coerced. Athens used this wealth to build the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean. Sparta dominated the land. It led the Peloponnesian League, an alliance of land powers. Sparta's hoplite army was legendary. Its soldiers trained from childhood for war. They were disciplined, brutal, and effective. Sparta was a militarized society where free citizens devoted themselves entirely to warfare while enslaved helots did all productive labor. The two powers had different political systems, different values, different visions for Greece. Athens was democratic, though only for a minority of its population. Sparta was oligarchic and conservative. It valued military virtue above all else. These differences made conflict seem inevitable. The war began with Spartan armies invading Attica, the region surrounding Athens. The Spartan strategy was straightforward: ravage the countryside, destroy crops, burn farms, force Athens to fight a land battle. Pericles, the Athenian leader, refused. He brought the rural population behind Athens' walls. He relied on the navy to import food and to raid Sparta's allies. Then the plague struck. The disease killed a quarter of Athens' population. It killed Pericles himself. It shattered Athenian morale and strategy. The plague was not a military defeat, but it had military consequences. Leadership was disrupted. Manpower was depleted. The psychological blow was devastating. The fighting dragged on year after year. Spartan armies marched into Attica and destroyed crops. Athenian fleets raided coastal cities. Allies switched sides. The war spread to Sicily, to Asia Minor. More and more Greek city-states were drawn into the conflict. In 427, both sides agreed to the Peace of Nicias. The treaty was supposed to last 50 years. It barely survived 8. Neither side honored all its terms. Allies continued fighting proxy conflicts. Trust was gone. The peace was merely an intermission. The war reignited in 415 when Athens launched a massive expedition to conquer Syracuse and Sicily. The Sicilian expedition was a disaster of epic proportions. Athens sent over 200 ships and thousands of soldiers. The campaign dragged on for 2 years. The Syracusans, with Spartan help, trapped the Athenian fleet in the harbor. They destroyed it almost completely. Thousands of Athenian soldiers were killed or captured. Those captured were enslaved. The loss was catastrophic. Athens had gambled its future on Sicilian conquest and lost. The defeat emboldened its enemies. Sparta renewed the war with Persian financial support. Persian gold allowed Sparta to build a fleet to challenge Athenian naval supremacy. One by one, Athens' allies defected or were conquered. The war ground on through betrayal, starvation, and desperation. Athens experienced political upheaval. Democracy was briefly overthrown by oligarchs. Democratic leaders rejected Spartan peace offers and continued fighting even as the situation became hopeless. The end came in 405 at the Battle of Aegae. The Spartan fleet under Lysander surprised and destroyed the Athenian navy. Without its fleet, Athens could not import food. Sparta blockaded the city. Athens starved. After months of siege, with people dying of hunger in the streets, Athens surrendered. The terms were harsh. Athens' walls were torn down. The long walls connecting the city to its port were demolished. The fleet was reduced to a handful of ships. A pro-Spartan oligarchy was installed. The 30 tyrants who ruled through terror until they were overthrown a year later. Athens survived as a city but never regained its former power. The Golden Age was over. The democracy that had made Athens famous continued but was diminished. The cultural flowering faded. Athens became just another Greek city-state. Sparta won the war but gained little. Its hegemony over Greece lasted barely a generation. The Spartans proved unable to govern the empire they had conquered. Within decades, Thebes defeated Sparta and ended Spartan dominance. The victory had been Pyrrhic, but the greatest casualties were human. Tens of thousands of soldiers died in battles whose names are now forgotten. Civilians died when their cities were besieged, when their crops were burned. Women and children were enslaved when cities fell. Entire populations were wiped out in massacres that both sides committed. The Peloponnesian War transformed Greek warfare from something relatively restrained into something approaching total war. Before the conflict, Greek battles followed certain conventions. Armies met on open ground. Hoplites clashed in organized formations. Civilians were generally not targeted. The war between Athens and Sparta shattered these conventions. Thucydides documented the breakdown of civilized norms with clinical precision. He described how the conflict brutalized everyone it touched, how fear and hatred replaced traditional restraints, how atrocities that would have been unthinkable at the war's beginning became routine by its end. The siege of Plataea provides an early example. Plataea was a small city allied with Athens. In 429, a Spartan army surrounded the city and began a siege that lasted 2 years. When the city finally surrendered, the Spartans executed all the adult men, about 200 people. They enslaved the women and children. Then they razed the city to the ground. This was the extermination of a community. Mytilene, on the island of Lesbos, tried to revolt from Athens in 428. When Athens recaptured the city, the assembly debated punishment. Cleon argued that all adult males should be executed and everyone else enslaved. The assembly voted to do exactly that. They sent a ship with orders to carry out the massacre. The next day, some Athenians experienced regret. The assembly reconvened and narrowly voted to reverse the decision. A second ship raced to overtake the first. It arrived just in time. Instead of killing all the men, Athens executed only the ringleaders, about 1,000 people. This was considered merciful. The fact that executing 1,000 people counted as mercy shows how the war had corrupted moral judgment. Melos experienced no such mercy. In 416, Athens demanded that the neutral island of Melos join its empire. The Melians refused. Athens responded by besieging the island. When Melos surrendered, Athens killed all adult males and enslaved all women and children. An entire population was eliminated or dispersed simply for wishing to remain independent. Thucydides recorded the Melian dialogue, a debate between Athenian and Melian leaders. The Athenians made no pretense of justice. They argued that the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. Morality was irrelevant. Only power mattered. This naked cynicism shows how far Athens had fallen from its ideals. The massacre at Mycalissos in Boeotia demonstrates the war's impact on civilians. In 413, Thracian mercenaries in Athenian service sacked this small town. They killed indiscriminately. Men, women, children. They even attacked a boys' school and killed all the children inside. Thucydides called it the greatest disaster to strike a city that size. These were not isolated incidents. Throughout the war, city after city experienced siege, massacre, or enslavement. The island of Sione, the city of Amphipolis, each represented hundreds or thousands of lives destroyed, families torn apart, communities eliminated. The treatment of prisoners deteriorated as the war continued. Early in the conflict, prisoners might be ransomed or exchanged. As bitterness grew, prisoners were increasingly enslaved or executed. When Athens' Sicilian expedition failed, the Syracusans captured thousands of Athenian soldiers and sailors. They imprisoned them in stone quarries where many died from exposure, starvation, and disease. Naval warfare became particularly brutal. When a ship was disabled, its crew often drowned or was killed in the water. Rescue of enemy sailors was uncommon. Ships rammed and sank each other. Sailors weighted down by armor had little chance of survival. Sea battles produced casualty rates far higher than land battles because the wounded simply drowned. Starvation became a weapon. Cities under siege faced food shortages that killed civilians by the hundreds or thousands. Athens starved during Sparta's final blockade. People died in the streets, bodies went unburied. This was deliberate. The goal was to force surrender by making the population suffer. The economic devastation was comprehensive. Armies deliberately destroyed agricultural infrastructure. They cut down olive trees that took decades to mature. They burned vineyards. They poisoned wells. This was not just about winning battles. It was about making enemy territory unable to support its population. Women and children became spoils of war. When cities fell, the female population was enslaved. Wives became slaves. Daughters became slaves. Children who had never held a weapon became property. The Spartans did this. The Athenians did this. Every major power in the war did this. The war normalized cruelty. Acts that would have shocked people at the war's beginning became unremarkable by its end. Massacres were routine. Enslavement was expected. Treachery was strategic. The moral framework that had limited earlier conflicts dissolved under the pressure of 27 years of total war. The generation that fought the Peloponnesian War learned that civilized norms were optional, that in true existential conflicts, anything was permissible, that the strong could do whatever they wanted to the weak. These lessons poisoned Greek culture for decades. This was the reality of war in ancient Greece, not heroic hoplites clashing in glorious battle, but civilians massacred, cities destroyed, populations enslaved, starvation deployed as a weapon, an entire civilization brutalized by a conflict that served no purpose except the ambitions of the powerful. Food was never abundant in ancient Greece. The geography itself conspired against agricultural success. Rocky soil, limited rainfall, mountains dividing the land into isolated pockets, hot, dry summers that baked the earth. These were not conditions for easy farming, yet the Greeks had to feed themselves from this difficult land or import food at great expense. The soil along the coasts was particularly poor, rocky and thin. Even with irrigation and crop rotation, farmers struggled to coax harvests from it. The plains had better soil, but the plains were limited. Most Greek territory was hills and mountains where large-scale agriculture was impossible. Wheat was the preferred grain, the mark of prosperity. But wheat required good soil and adequate water. It grew well only in the plains, and there was never enough. Athens had to import wheat from the Black Sea region, from Egypt, from Sicily. This made Athenian food security dependent on controlling sea lanes. A naval defeat or disrupted trade route meant hunger at home. Barley was more common because it tolerated poor soil better. Most Greeks ate barley bread most of the time. It was coarser than wheat bread, less desirable, but more reliable. Barley became the staple grain for the majority. Wheat bread was a luxury. Bread formed the core of the Greek diet. It was eaten at every meal, dipped in wine for breakfast, accompanying whatever vegetables or fish might be available. The word for relish literally meant something eaten with bread. Bread was not a side. Everything else was the side. Bread was the meal. Olives and olive oil were essential. Olive trees grew well in Greek soil and climate. They required little water once established. They produced reliably year after year. Olive oil was used for cooking, for lighting lamps, for personal hygiene. The olive harvest was a critical event each year. A bad olive harvest meant hardship. Grapes grew well in Greece. Wine was a standard drink for everyone, diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric. The poor drank cheaper, heavily watered wine. The rich drank better wine, less diluted. But everyone drank wine because water sources were often contaminated. Vegetables supplemented the diet when available. Onions, garlic, leeks, cabbage, lettuce, beans and lentils provided crucial protein. These were grown in household gardens or purchased at market. But vegetables were never abundant. They required water and attention. Fruit was available seasonally. Figs were common and important, rich in sugar and calories. Grapes eaten fresh or dried as raisins. Apples, pears, pomegranates for those who could afford them, but fruit trees took years to establish and produce. They required land. Meat was rare for most Greeks. Pork, beef, lamb, goat. These were expensive animals, required feed and land. Most families could not afford to slaughter animals regularly. Meat appeared on tables primarily during religious festivals when animals were sacrificed and the meat distributed. For the poor, meat might be eaten only a few times a year, festival days, special occasions. The rest of the time, their diet was bread, olives, whatever vegetables they could obtain, perhaps some fish if they lived near the coast. This monotony was broken rarely. Fish and seafood were more accessible in coastal areas. Fishermen caught various species. Coastal dwellers had protein sources that inland populations lacked, but fishing was dangerous work. For inland populations, fish was expensive and came preserved in salt. Cheese provided another protein source. Goats and sheep were kept for milk. The milk was turned into cheese that could be stored. Cheese was more common than meat, more affordable, more practical for people without refrigeration. Honey was the only sweetener available. Sugar was unknown. Honey was precious, produced by bees that had to be kept and managed. It was expensive enough that many families used it sparingly or not at all. The diet was monotonous and barely adequate nutritionally. It provided calories, enough to work and function, but it lacked variety, lacked abundance. People ate to survive, not for pleasure. The rich ate better, with more meat, more variety. But even the wealthy ate a diet that would seem limited today. Hunger was a constant companion for the poor. Not always starvation, though that too in bad years. More often chronic undernourishment, never quite eating enough, never getting adequate protein or vitamins. Bodies that were smaller, weaker, more vulnerable to disease. Bad harvests meant famine. If the grain crop failed, if the olive harvest was poor, if weather disrupted fishing, people went hungry. There were no emergency reserves, no government programs. When famine struck, people starved. The old and young died first. The poor died in larger numbers. The war made food scarcity worse. Armies trampled crops. Soldiers stole livestock. Trade routes were disrupted. Sieges cut cities off from food supplies. Rural populations fled to cities. Overwhelming food supplies. Hunger became a weapon. Food preparation was labor-intensive. Grain had to be ground into flour daily. This was women's work, requiring hours of grinding with stone mills. Olives had to be pressed for oil. Water had to be fetched from public wells. Fuel had to be gathered for cooking fires. Simply feeding a family consumed enormous time and effort for the poor. Food insecurity was constant. A bad harvest, an injury, illness. Any of these could push a family into hunger. There was no safety net. If you could not afford food, you went hungry. If you went hungry long enough, you died. This was daily life for most Greeks. Not the banquets described in literature, but the grinding struggle to obtain enough food to survive, to feed children who were always hungry, to face each harvest with anxiety, knowing failure meant hunger. Work in ancient Greece was not the fulfilling career we might imagine today. For the vast majority of people, work was hard physical labor performed from dawn to dusk, day after day, year after year, until their bodies gave out. There was no retirement, no weekends, no paid vacation. You worked until you could not work anymore. Farming was the occupation of most Greeks. Small farmers worked their own land, if they were fortunate enough to own any. They plowed fields behind oxen, if they could afford an ox. Otherwise, they dug with hand tools. The rocky Greek soil resisted cultivation. Every harvest required back-breaking effort. The farmer rose before dawn, fed his animals, walked to his fields, worked until the sun became unbearable at midday, rested briefly, returned to work in the afternoon, trudged home at sunset, ate a simple meal, collapsed into sleep, rose the next morning and repeated the cycle. Different seasons brought different tasks, all demanding. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer meant tending crops, fighting weeds. Autumn meant harvest, racing to gather crops before weather turned. Winter brought pruning, repairing tools, preparing for the next cycle. The work never stopped. A farmer worked in all weathers, blazing summer heat, cold winter rain, spring winds that scattered seed, autumn storms that threatened ripe crops. There was no climate-controlled shelter. Your body was exposed to the elements day after day. Injuries were common and often permanent. A misplaced axe blow, a fall from an olive tree, being kicked by an ox, straining your back lifting heavy loads. cuts that became infected. Most farmers accumulated injuries over their lifetime. By middle age, many were already crippled, arthritic, limping, missing fingers, bent from years of heavy labor. Craftsmen had different but equally demanding work. A potter sat at his wheel for hours, shaping clay with hands that cramped and ached. A blacksmith stood before a blazing forge, hammering metal until his arms burned. A weaver sat at a loom, performing repetitive motions that destroyed joints. Every craft had its particular toll on the body. Construction workers hauled stone, mixed mortar, climbed scaffolding, worked at heights where a fall meant death or crippling injury. The magnificent buildings we admire were built by men whose bodies were broken in the process. Each marble column represented countless hours of brutal labor. Dock workers loaded and unloaded ships. Heavy cargo moved by human muscle, amphorae full of wine or oil, sacks of grain, blocks of stone, all lifted, carried, stacked by men whose backs and joints suffered cumulative damage. A dock worker might labor from sunrise to sunset when ships were in port, then have no work when ships were absent. Fishermen faced different dangers. They went to sea in small boats, at the mercy of weather that could turn deadly. They hauled heavy nets. They mended nets with hands made clumsy by cold water. Many fishermen drowned. Many more suffered from exposure and accumulated damage. The workday was determined by daylight. You rose when it became light enough to see. You worked as long as light permitted. In summer, this meant brutally long days. There were no work shifts, no negotiated hours. You worked when work needed doing. Women's work was equally demanding. Running a household was not leisurely. Fetching water from public wells, carrying heavy jars, making multiple trips each day, grinding grain into flour with stone mills. This required hours of repetitive motion that caused lasting joint damage. Weaving was women's constant occupation. Setting up a loom, preparing thread, the actual weaving itself. Every piece of cloth your family wore had to be produced by hand. The work was never finished because cloth constantly needed replacement. Women also prepared all food. Time over cooking fires in houses with poor ventilation. Smoke inhalation, burns, constant bending, chopping, stirring, kneading, backs ached. Hands developed calluses, eyes watered from smoke. This was daily, unending labor. For the poor, work was even more precarious. Day laborers gathered at dawn in the agora, hoping to be hired if chosen. They worked that day for a small wage. If not chosen, they went hungry. There was no guarantee of work. Each morning was a gamble. Will someone hire me today? Some day laborers worked in agriculture. Some worked construction. Some did whatever job was available. The work was always hard. The pay was minimal. A day's wage might buy bread for that day, but leave nothing for tomorrow. An injury meant no work and no income. Slave labor was even more brutal. A slave had no choice in what work they did or how hard they worked. An owner could work slaves to death, and many did. Mine slaves. Agricultural slaves driven by overseers with whips. Domestic slaves worked whatever hours the household demanded. The psychological toll of this constant labor was immense. There was no respite, no hope for improvement. A farmer would farm until he died. A craftsman would work his craft until his body failed. Work was not a path to prosperity. It was survival. Barely. The concept of leisure was foreign to most Greeks. The wealthy enjoyed leisure. They attended theater. They exercised at the gymnasium. They debated philosophy. But they could do these things only because others did the work that supported them. For the vast majority, leisure was unknown. Religious festivals provided occasional breaks from labor, but these were infrequent. Most days were work days. Most years were work years. Most lifetimes were work lifetimes. The Greeks praised moderation and balance in life, but this ideal was for the elite. For the people who actually kept society functioning, there was only work. Endless, exhausting, body-destroying work. During times of plague or famine, when communities faced existential threats they could not understand or control, the Greeks turned to a ritual that reveals the darkest aspects of their civilization. It was called the pharmakos, and it involved selecting a human being to bear the community's pollution and suffering. This chosen person would be beaten, driven from the city, and in some cases killed. The word pharmakos shares a root with our word pharmacy. It referred to both a remedy and a poison. The ritual treated human beings as medicine, as substances that could absorb communal evil and remove it through their expulsion or death. The victims were not chosen randomly. The playwright Aristophanes wrote that they were exceedingly low-born, penniless, and useless. Anonymous ancient commentators suggested they were those mistreated by nature, meaning people with disabilities or deformities. The vulnerable, the marginal, the one society already considered expendable. When plague struck or crops failed, the community would select someone who fit these criteria. The person would be fed the poor quality food of slaves, given just enough to stay alive but nothing more. Then they would be beaten with branches from a wild fig tree, struck repeatedly to maximize humiliation and pain. After the beating, the pharmakos was driven from the city, cast out into the wilderness beyond the walls. The community believed this ritual expelled the pollution that had brought divine anger. The plague would end, the famine would break, the gods would be appeased, all because one person had suffered enough for everyone. Sometimes the ritual went further. The 2nd century writer Philostratus described an outbreak of plague in the city of Ephesus. A beggar was identified as the pharmakos. The crowd stoned him to death, not quickly, not mercifully, but through a slow pelting that must have been agonizing. When he finally died, the community believed they had purchased their salvation with his blood. According to scholar Jan Bremer, rituals like this took place throughout the Greco-Roman world. This was not some isolated practice in one strange city. It was widespread, accepted, built into the fabric of Greek religious life. When communities faced crises, they looked for someone to blame, someone to hurt, someone whose suffering would make them feel safer. The logic was twisted but internally consistent. The community was a body. When the body became sick, it needed to purge the corrupting element. The pharmakos was that element. By expelling this person, by making them suffer, the body politic could cleanse itself. The fact that the victim was innocent was irrelevant. They served a symbolic function. This dual nature of the pharmakos reflected ancient medical understanding. Drugs were seen as powerful substances that could kill or cure. The pharmakos was a human drug, applied to the community in crisis, expected to cure through sacrifice. The practice tells us something uncomfortable about Greek society. Despite all their philosophy, despite their emphasis on reason and justice, they were willing to torture and kill vulnerable people when they were afraid. The homeless, the disabled, the poor, anyone who lacked social standing. These people became expendable when the community felt threatened. The ritual also reveals how Greeks understood causation. They did not know about bacteria or viruses. They believed plagues came from divine anger, that famines resulted from religious pollution. If the gods were punishing the community, then the solution was religious. Sacrifice, purification, expulsion of the polluted element. This made a certain terrible sense within their worldview. If pollution caused plague, then removing pollution should end plague. The pharmakos became the physical embodiment of that pollution. Their expulsion or death was meant to restore balance. Of course, it did not work. Plagues ended when they ran their course, or when weather changed, or when disease exhausted the pool of susceptible victims. Famines ended when crops grew again. The pharmakos ritual accomplished nothing except adding one more victim to the toll of suffering. But the Greeks continued the practice because they believed it worked. The existence of the pharmakos ritual complicates our view of Greek civilization. We want to believe in the rational philosophical Greeks, the inventors of democracy and logic. But those same Greeks beat disabled beggars and drove them into the wilderness to die. They stoned people to death believing it would cure disease. Both things are true, the glory and the darkness, the philosophy and the brutality, the democracy and the scapegoating. Greek civilization was complex, contradictory, and in many ways monstrous. Understanding it requires acknowledging both its achievements and its crimes. The pharmakos was not an aberration. It was an accepted part of their religious life, a tool they used when they felt threatened. The casualness with which sources mention it suggests it was normal, unremarkable, just another ritual among many. This normalization of violence against the vulnerable was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Greek hardship. It was not just that life was difficult, it was that the society actively victimized those who were already suffering most, the poor, the disabled, the homeless. These were the people selected for the pharmakos. Their existing marginalization made them targets. The pharmakos ritual captures what we have been discussing. The hardships of ancient Greece fell most heavily on those least able to bear them. Society was structured to extract maximum suffering from the vulnerable while protecting the privileged. And when crisis came, it was still the vulnerable who paid the highest price. The achievements of ancient Greece are real and undeniable. The philosophy that shapes Western thought, the art that defines classical beauty, the political innovations that influence democratic systems worldwide. These accomplishments deserve recognition, but we must ask a question that is rarely posed with sufficient honesty. Who paid for these achievements? At whose expense were they purchased? The answer is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Every philosophical dialogue written by Plato was made possible because enslaved people cooked his meals, cleaned his home, and managed his affairs. Every moment he spent contemplating the nature of justice was a moment he did not spend working to survive. His leisure, which produced works of genius, was purchased with other people's labor. Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great and wrote treatises that would influence thought for millennia. He could do this because he came from a wealthy family, because slaves handled the practical necessities of life. His intellectual freedom was built on others' bondage. The Parthenon stands as perhaps the greatest architectural achievement of classical Athens. We admire its perfect proportions, its elegant columns, its sculptural decoration. But thousands of workers hauled stone, hundreds of craftsmen carved details. Most were slaves or poor citizens desperate for wages. They worked in dangerous conditions. They suffered injuries. Some died. The temple we celebrate was constructed by people whose names we will never know. Greek drama flourished in Athens during the 5th century. Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, their plays explored profound questions about fate, justice, and human nature. But the plays were written for festivals funded by wealthy citizens. They were performed for audiences that had the leisure to attend. The slaves who made those festivals possible could not be in the audience. The women who managed households so men could attend were not welcome to watch. Democracy in Athens is celebrated as a revolutionary achievement, and in some ways it was, but citizenship was limited to free adult males born to Athenian parents. This was perhaps 10 to 15% of the population. The democracy that we praise was made possible by excluding the vast majority. More than that, democracy required leisure. You had to have time to attend assemblies, time to serve on juries. Citizens could afford this time because others did their work. Slaves farmed their land. Wives managed their households. Foreigners produced goods and paid taxes. The democracy functioned only because most people were denied any voice in it. The Olympic Games embodied Greek ideals of physical excellence. Athletes trained for years to compete. Winners received glory that could last generations. But only free men with resources could become Olympic athletes. Poor men who had to work could not afford years of training. Women could not compete. Enslaved people were barred entirely. Greek philosophy itself reveals this dynamic. Socrates encouraged others to examine their lives, but his most famous saying, that the unexamined life is not worth living, assumes you have time to examine your life. A slave working 12 hours in a mine has no time for self-examination. A woman grinding grain before dawn has no leisure for philosophical reflection. The unexamined life may not be worth living, but examining your life is a luxury most Greeks could not afford. The irony cuts deeper. Greek philosophers wrote extensively about virtue, justice, and the good life. Yet they accepted slavery as natural. They accepted women's subordination as proper. They accepted poverty as moral failing. Their philosophy, for all its brilliance, functioned to justify the exploitation on which their society rested. Every sculpture we admire was carved by hands that ached and bled. Every philosophical text was written by someone who never had to worry about survival because others ensured their comfort. Every democratic debate was conducted by men whose participation depended on excluding most people from the political community. The glory of Greece rested on a foundation of suffering. The temples were built by slaves. The symposiums were attended by men whose wives were confined to back rooms. The armies that expanded Greek influence were filled with soldiers from poor families. The silver that funded Athenian power was dug by enslaved people dying in dark tunnels. We cannot separate the achievements from the exploitation. They are intertwined. The same society that produced Plato also worked people to death in mines. The same city that pioneered democracy also kept women as property. The same culture that created timeless art also practiced ritual scapegoating of the vulnerable. Understanding this does not require us to reject Greek achievements, but it does require us to see them fully, to acknowledge what they cost, to recognize whose suffering purchased them, to remember that glory and brutality existed side by side. The hardships of living in ancient Greece were not incidental to its greatness. They were structural, necessary. The exploitation of the many made possible the achievements of the few. This was not accidental. It was how the system was designed to function. When we celebrate ancient Greece, we must ask ourselves what we are celebrating. The philosophy, yes. The art, certainly. The political innovations, absolutely. But we must also acknowledge the human cost, the slaves who died, the women who were silenced, the poor who were excluded, the children who were abandoned, the vulnerable who were scapegoated. Greek civilization achieved greatness, but that greatness was purchased with the suffering of countless individuals whose names we do not know. They deserve to be part of the narrative, not just the philosophers and politicians, but the people who made it all possible through their labor, their sacrifice, their suffering. This is the complete picture of ancient Greece. We have walked through the shadows of ancient Greece, through the lives of people whose names history never recorded, through experiences that textbooks often omit, through suffering that marble monuments do not reveal. Now we must ask ourselves what we have learned. What does it mean to truly understand a civilization? The Greece we were taught to admire was real. The philosophy was brilliant. The art was magnificent. The political innovations were transformative. These achievements genuinely shaped human history, but they are not the whole story. They are not even most of the story. For every philosopher who had time to contemplate justice, there were hundreds of people who never had time to contemplate anything except survival. For every sculpture that celebrated the ideal human form, there were thousands of real human bodies broken by labor. For every democratic debate, there were countless people whose voices were never heard. The glory existed, but so did the suffering. And the suffering was not separate from the glory. It was the foundation on which glory was built. We tend to view history through the lens of great men and great achievements. We study kings and generals. We memorize dates of battles. We analyze philosophical texts and artistic movements. This approach is not wrong, but it isn't complete. It shows us the peaks of human accomplishment while hiding the valleys of human misery that made those peaks possible. Ancient Greece teaches us that civilization always has a price, that cultural flowering requires resources concentrated in few hands, that intellectual achievement demands leisure purchased with others' labor, that beauty often masks exploitation. These are uncomfortable truths, but they are truths nonetheless. The hardships we have explored were not accidents. They were structural features, necessary components of how Greek civilization functioned. Slavery was not a regrettable practice that happened to exist alongside democracy. Slavery made democracy possible by freeing citizens from labor. The subordination of women was not an unfortunate cultural blind spot. It was essential to how society was organized. Poverty was not a problem the Greeks failed to solve. It was a condition they required to maintain their social hierarchy. Understanding this changes how we view not just ancient Greece but civilization itself. Modern societies have abolished slavery in most of the world. Women have gained rights that would have been unthinkable in ancient times. Democracy has expanded to include previously excluded groups. But we must also recognize continuity. Modern societies still concentrate wealth and power in few hands, if still exploit vulnerable populations. The mechanisms have changed. The justifications have evolved. But the basic pattern persists. Ancient Greece holds up a mirror to us. We see in it the origins of much that we value: philosophy, democracy, art, science. But if we look closely, we also see the origins of much we would prefer not to acknowledge: exploitation, exclusion, violence, the casual brutality toward those deemed less worthy. These too are part of our inheritance. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: greatness and cruelty can coexist. The same people who produced sublime philosophy also owned slaves. The same societies that pioneered democracy also denied rights to most of their inhabitants. The same culture that created timeless beauty also practiced systematic oppression. Human beings are capable of both the noblest and the basest actions, often simultaneously. This does not mean we should dismiss Greek achievements. It means we should understand them in full context. When we study Plato, we should remember the slaves who made his philosophical leisure possible. When we admire the Parthenon, we should think of the workers whose bodies were broken building it. When we celebrate Athenian democracy, we should acknowledge the women, foreigners, and enslaved people who were excluded. History is not a collection of inspiring stories about great men doing great things. It is the full record of human experience, including the experiences of those who suffered. If we only tell the stories of triumph and ignore the stories of hardship, we learn nothing true about the past. The people we have discussed, the slaves and the poor and the confined women and the abandoned children and the scapegoated victims, they were not background characters in someone else's story. They were human beings with hopes and fears, with loves and losses, with dignity and worth. Their suffering was not less real because it served someone else's glory. Their lives mattered, even though history mostly forgot them. We cannot change what happened in ancient Greece. The suffering has already occurred. But we can choose how we remember. We can choose to tell the whole story, not just the parts that make us comfortable. We can choose to honor those who suffered by acknowledging their suffering. We can choose to learn from history rather than romanticize it. Ancient Greece was not a paradise. It was not an ideal civilization that we should emulate. It was a complex, contradictory, often brutal society that produced both remarkable achievements and terrible suffering. Understanding this fully, seeing both the light and the darkness, is the only way to truly comprehend what it meant to live in that time and place. This is the hardship of living in ancient Greece, not just individual difficulties, but the systemic exploitation that made civilization possible, not just personal misfortunes, but the structural violence built into society itself, the price that was paid for glory. Now you have seen behind the facades, you cannot unknow it. The hardships of ancient Greece are now part of your understanding of history, and perhaps part of your understanding of the present as well.